So the book brings together two independent series of poems. They are not linked in terms of subject, but they both deal with kind of processes of translation or responses to source texts. Solo for Mascha Voice is a response to the poems of Mascha Voice, their replies to her poems, which are kind of love lyrics, often kind of like melancholic. They're also witty, and they're quite strange as well. Kaleko was a Polish-born Jewish German language poet who sort of came to prominence in the Weimar era. Her poems were forbidden and censored by the Nazis. She ended up fleeing with her husband to America, but they also had this strange life in that they were passed around, often in handwritten form, kind of like these love lyrics that sort of circulated secretly. So there's an interesting history about her own work, but I think my responses, my replies, are kind of born out of an interest in how I've been able to read her work prior to there being English language translation. So I read her work first through online translation software and trying to make sense of those and that material there. So the replies are perhaps not like inaccurate, not entirely accurate. They have, I'm not sure entirely what it is I'm replying to. Because I don't speak German myself. So there's a process involved there that's to do with kind of confusion and distance, and that plays into the fact that through responding to these love lyrics, there's almost a kind of a romantic dynamic about the way that my replies speak to this distant person, this distant lover, I suppose. Tenuous Rooms is a series of poems that kind of deal with more canonical texts, so things like John Donne, Dante, who else is there? There's Verlaine, Rossetti, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, so kind of poems that I've found in their original form or in their translated form, or in the case of Dante I used online translation software again from the original Italian. So a way of kind of both estranging and revisiting these texts, because they've always felt kind of strange for me. If I read a John Donne poem, I don't feel like it's the language is immediately accessible. It's an older version of English that I kind of have to do a bit of work of translating anyway, intralingually. So with those poems, it's kind of an act of of reading, but a very active form of reading, and totally free as well. They're free translations, so if I can find an equivalent, which is, I suppose, like part of what translation seems to be about, that equivalency isn't necessarily denotational. It might be, to me, a connotational equivalency. It might be it might just be something that the original sets moving, and that practice I think foregrounds a lot of the things about like courtly love poems or the themes or ideas of earlier love poetry, which is often seems kind of corny now to us, or the sort of excessive romanticism and the performative gestures of love poetry, which I've always been interested in. The way in which when Dante is talking about or to his beloved, he's kind of totally emo about it. There's really no and it's really for him. It seems like it doesn't seem like they're necessarily they're in honor of his feelings and the excessive sort of overwhelming nature of those feelings. So I guess the whole series kind of sends up or is aware of or plays with that kind of excessive element or the kind of camp of it, but also I think it's like I like that. I like the campy element of courtly love poetry and the cliche, so that also is a feature of the sort of tone of the work. I guess I always envisaged them being like published together because they felt quite separate to my normal practice as a poet. I don't consider myself like a lyric poet in the sense that I'm never really writing about myself, but with these poems you're definitely, that your starting point is somebody else, or somebody else's poem, and the strategies is kind of almost like I always also think that a poem is something that you're inviting the participation in. So these is like starting as a participant in somebody else's poem. So they're kind of in terms of the dynamics of reading, starting from similar points. Though with the Kaleko poems, and there was something about trying to get close to this idea of a voice that I felt was coming through, and that was always further away from me, that was always inaccessible, and that inaccessibility is kind of partly to do with, it's part of why the poems are kind of love lyrics or forlorn love lyrics, and those are the poems I selected from Kaleko's work. And also their replies, they're kind of, I suppose they're both part mimicking her work, but also guessing, because I don't know what it is exactly I'm mimicking, because I can't read the source text, I can't read her poems. So there's a kind of reaching or trying to find, there's an exploration, and that means that the voice that I've written them in, it feels very separate from my own, or it feels like a voice that I've created to find this other voice which I can't quite get at. Whereas Tenuous Rooms, I think there's a recognition of a kind of where maybe the lyric tradition comes from, and wanting to kind of play with that and camp it up and not subvert, because I think that's kind of like, that's a banal way of talking about the kind of responses I wanted to make. More that I wasn't writing towards the text. I definitely felt that there was some sort of like transverse or digressive, or where they tended to lead me somewhere else, to walk towards my own mind and my own experience as a participant in those poems. Participation in those poems seems to be a lot easier, and for that reason they felt more like things that I was playing with, rather than I think there was a bit more reverence with the Kaleko, or a desire to be respectful. With the Tenuous Rooms, I think there's deference but also irreverence. I think part of the reason I undertook these projects separate from my practice was because I saw that there was something to be learned about reading and what language is and does, and how, and what poetry kind of retains as a form of language, as a sort of epistemology, the kind of knowledge that poems can contain or direct you to, and how that relates to the exact terms that they use, or how it sometimes doesn't seem to relate to the exact terms, and so changing the terms or finding terms for something, that seemed like a way to get further into that problem or that question, not to solve it. I feel like, if anything, I'm less sure about what I've done with these poems. I feel like less clear about what it means to respond to something, but I feel like in being less sure, I've also kind of muddied things for myself. I've kind of got in there a bit, and that, I think, is an important thing for me to have done just as a writer. I feel like it's refreshed and challenged a few things, and like the voice that's come from this has fed back into my own poems, and I think that that's interesting, that maybe through doing things that you think are different to what you normally do, you're actually that's a lie in your head. You're just you tend to, when things have been worked for you in the past in what you're doing, you tend to seek out a repetition of that feeling and that effect. You repeat the patterns. So choosing a different way into these poems and finding a different way out means that that sequence of returning to the same place or starting point has changed, and the voice is changed as a result of that. So I've definitely learned from them, but I've no idea what I've learned, and I'm still unsure how they relate to my poems or the poems that they've either sought to find or sought to understand. I think I've always written love poems and always had a preoccupation with love poems, and that's partly because I'm interested in the dynamics of the traditional love poem, but I'm also kind of interested in love as an awkward term, and a term that's various, and also I think it's that it actually talks or speaks to what poetry kind of seeks to do, which is move away from reductive forms of language. It tries to bring complexity within reach, and I think that term love, it's the biggest reduction, and it's the biggest kind of most awkward kind of handle for a concept. And so love poetry always seems to want to complicate it. It always seems to try and find a new form or a new dynamic or construction or way in. It's a sort of it keeps the sort of Venn diagram of love as an idea, as a concept. It keeps it moving. And so yeah, I think that love poetry, I don't want to say something like facile, all poetry is love poetry, but I definitely feel that that word love is its inadequacy and its ubiquity is interesting, and poetry kind of also deals with these themes of collective experience, or the promise of some kind of communal inquiry, and communal experiences and sharedness, and also the uniqueness and the difference. And so there's this dissonance bound up in what poetry tends to seek to do, speaking in a generalization, and how we encounter and talk about love. That there's a shared dissonance in those ideas, and I'm kind of both obsessed with. I'm obsessed with both of those, and maybe to the point where I can't really distinguish between love and poetry. Well, it's really good looking, and it's so if you want to you don't want to be shallow about it, but if you want to fall in love with a book, it should be a good looking one. Right, this love poetry. So and it's a babe, I think.